Number 16. The tiny tank that carried a bomb. On August 8, 1944, Warsaw was already burning through its second week of uprising, and a German motorized assault engineer battalion rolled in with a strange line item in its equipment list: remote demolition carriers. 3 days later, at about 8 a.m. on August 11th, two of them were sent toward home army positions near Okopowa and Dzika streets. The machine was the toy-sized tank built to crawl under a real one. It looked absurd until it moved. Low to the ground, tracked, and sealed around a warhead, the Goliath was meant to disappear into rubble and go out in one violent flash. The SDKFZ-302 carried 60 kilograms of explosive. The later SDKFZ-303A carried 75 kilograms, and the 303B pushed that to 100. On paper, that is enough to erase a barricade, crack a bunker face, gut a vehicle, or punch through a building entrance. In the street, it looked like a child's machine with murder inside it. That was the myth: a tiny robot tank. A clever German answer to concrete and anti-tank fire. But the evidence says something less elegant and far more fragile. The Goliath was not radio-controlled like people often assume. It was wire-guided, and the wire was not just the steering system. It was the machine's nervous system. About 650 meters of three-core cable trailed behind it, linking the vehicle to an operator who stayed far back from the blast. Cut the wire, and the weapon did not explode in triumph. It stopped being a weapon at all. That mattered in Warsaw, where the streets were broken, narrow, and full of debris. Cracked machine could crawl over rubble, but the cable had to survive every snag, curb, wall, shell crater, and burst of small arms fire along the way. The Goliath could be armored at the nose, but the line behind it was exposed, thin, and easy to ruin. The weapon was built to survive the approach. Its control path was not. By August 14th, the Germans tried again in the northern Old Town, aiming a SDKFZ-303 at a key barricade near Sierakowska and Zoliborska streets. The defenders were commanded by Jan Sipowski, known by the code name Forrester. He did not wait for the machine to arrive neatly at the wall. He went after it himself and disabled it before it could detonate. That is the part the propaganda version never likes. Not a perfect remote kill, not a clean armored solution. A man running into the path of a crawling bomb and stopping it with his own hands. Captured German soldiers dragged the machine back. The defenders disarmed it and removed the explosive charge. By August 17th, Sipowski had studied the device closely enough to issue instructions on how to deal with future Goliaths. Once you have seen one up close, the myth thins out fast. The armor was only 10 millimeters on the front of the 303A. The top speed was about 10 to 11 kilometers an hour. The whole thing weighed 365 kilograms, and every inch of it depended on a cable that could be broken by artillery, small arms, or even the ground itself if the route turned bad. And yet, thousands were built. The SDKFZ-302 electric version reached roughly 2,650 vehicles by January 1944. The gasoline-powered 303 series climbed higher still, with production figures that do not even match perfectly between records. Source gives 5,179. Another gives 4,929. Even the total count resists a clean answer, which fits a weapon that looked simple until anyone tried to use it in real combat. The Goliath was never just a bomb on tracks. It was an attempt to mechanize distance, to let a soldier kill from behind cover while a disposable machine crawled into the danger. But the closer the machine got to the target, the more it depended on the one thing easiest to destroy. The explosive was huge. The cable was tiny. In Warsaw, that tiny line decided everything. Number 15. Fire in the bunker. Why would any soldier strap fuel to his own back and walk toward a bunker that already had him ranged in? On February 23, 1945, on Iwo Jima, Corporal Herschel Woody Williams did exactly that. He was with Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division. They were pushing inland from the beach toward the airfield through black volcanic sand that gave under every step. Mines were buried ahead. Japanese machine guns were not. They were hidden in concrete pillboxes and caves, linked so one position could cover the next. Artillery had hit them. Tanks had tried to open a lane. Rifle fire kept finding walls. The problem was no longer reaching the line. It was killing men you could barely see, inside positions that ordinary fire could punish but not clear. Williams volunteered to go forward with a flamethrower and 4 riflemen covering him. That part sounds backward. A filled American M2 carried about 70 pounds on the operator's back, with roughly 4 gallons of fuel. Empty, it was 43. With suitable thickened fuel, effective range could reach about 40 yards, but the number that mattered most was 0. 0 armor, 0 safe distance if the bunker spotted you first. For roughly 4 hours, Williams kept doing the same impossible job. He moved out under fire, attacked a position, came back for another serviced flamethrower and demolition charges, then went out again. The citation is blunt. It does not need flourish. The ground itself was trying to stop him. The defenders were too. 2 of the 4 Marines covering him were killed. Here, the weapon matters for what it could do. It made hiding inside a fortification feel worse than running from it. The American M2 flamethrower, standardized in its M2-2 form in February 1944, was built for the Pacific War's ugliest geometry. By VJ Day, 24,601 had been manufactured. Not for spectacle, for caves, embrasures, vents, and blind corners that kept surviving everything cleaner. In the Pacific, its deadliness did not come from sweeping open ground. It came from what happened when burning fuel got inside a place designed to keep every other weapon out. At one pillbox on Iwo Jima, Williams climbed on top of it, not beside it, on top. Then he put the nozzle into an air vent and fired. At another position, Japanese riflemen charged him with bayonets, and he turned the weapon on them too. Witnesses later credited him with neutralizing 7 pillboxes. 7 does not sound large until you picture each one clearly. A machine gun nest pinning down in advance, a concrete knot in the line, a slit in the hill that tanks could not silence and riflemen could not approach cleanly. The mechanics are colder than the image. Wartime U.S. studies found that fire outside a pillbox often did little to the men inside. The wall of flame was not the point. If the fuel stayed outside, the bunker could keep fighting. So the operator had to get close enough to feed burning fuel through an opening, an embrasure, a cave mouth, a vent. Exposure was measured in body lengths. A machine gun firing from 200 yards away is one problem. A firing slit 20 yards away is another. You are carrying the answer on your back, but to use it, you have to walk up to the slit. Another detail is often wrong in people's minds. Picture the tanks on the operator's back as a movie bomb. One lucky shot, and he vanishes in a fireball. Wartime reporting was less cinematic and more unnerving. In one Pacific case, an operator abandoned a serviced flamethrower and shot its fuel tanks with a .45 pistol. The fuel did not ignite. It did not explode. That matters. The danger was the approach. Being seen. Being fixed in place while carrying 70 pounds you could not sprint with through ash-like sand under intersecting fire. If this video keeps asking what made a weapon deadly in World War II, the flamethrower gives a clear answer. Sometimes it was not the weapon that killed the most or reached the farthest. It was the one built for a problem nothing else could solve at close range. Williams was not sent to burn a field or break a charge in the open. He was sent because sealed positions kept surviving shells, bullets, and steel. By the end of those 4 hours, the route inland had begun to open. But the image that survives is smaller and more precise than any battlefield map. A concrete box. A vent. A man climbing onto the roof with burning fuel on his back while riflemen tried to keep him alive for a few more seconds. The target was never the ground around the bunker. It was the air inside it. At the next pillbox, Williams went up again with the nozzle first. Number 14. The disposable tank killer. In 1942, German infantry on the Eastern Front kept running into heavier Soviet armor. At HASAG, Dr. Heinrich Langweiler was asked for something almost insultingly simple. Not a bigger gun, not a new tank. A cheap tube one man could carry, fire once, and throw away. The front was swallowing expensive answers. A towed anti-tank gun needed time, a crew, training, and a position you then had to defend. A Panzerfaust needed almost none of that. It was a short metal tube with a shaped charge bomb, built to be handed out fast and fired at point-blank range. The earliest version gave German troops only about 30 meters. That is not much of a battlefield. It is the distance across a doorway. When the first models reached the German army in August 1943, the weapon was already defined by its weakness. The range was tiny. The launcher was crude. The user had to wait until a tank came close enough to make the shot possible. But the shaped charge did not depend much on speed. It depended on geometry. If the blast formed correctly, the armor could be punched through even though the weapon itself was almost laughably small. The improved version Langweiler helped develop could pierce around 200 millimeters of armor, and it weighed a little over 5 kilograms. The Panzerfaust was not built to fight like a gun. It was built to vanish after one shot. A disposable anti-tank weapon sounds minor until you picture a tank crew rolling into a city street with no obvious gun line ahead, only windows, doorways, and broken upper floors. The first issue patterns were simple enough for quick training. By September 1944, the Panzerfaust 60 had extended that reach to 60 meters. Still close, still dangerous. Close enough that the tank could see you first if you moved badly. The launcher itself was barely more than a meter long. In museum form, a Panzerfaust 60 is about 1,050 millimeters in length. Long enough to matter, short enough to hide beside a wall. The backblast made every shot a gamble. This was not a rocket launcher in the modern sense. It was closer to a small recoilless gun using a gunpowder charge, with fins stabilizing the bomb after it left the tube. So the hard part was not simply making the projectile fly. The hard part was staying alive long enough to fire it. The best armor penetration in the world meant nothing if the shooter was dead in the doorway. So the Panzerfaust spread. In the second half of 1943, mass production finally began in earnest. By late war, Germany had turned out more than 8 million Panzerfaust-type weapons. Not because they were elegant, because they were cheap, fast, and everywhere. The army could hand them to frightened infantry, Volkssturm boys, exhausted conscripts, men with almost no anti-tank training, and tell them a tank had become vulnerable at the distance of a room and a half. That was the promise. It was also the trap. The weapon was terrifying in a street, a cellar entrance, or a gap between ruined buildings. But reputation is not the same thing as strategic control. In Berlin in April 1945, General Semyon Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army reported heavy vehicle losses in urban fighting. Panzerfaust teams hiding in uncleared upper floors were part of the reason. Yet Bogdanov's own figures cut through the legend. 106 of 576 disabled vehicles, or 18.4%, were attributed to Panzerfaust fire. Yes, not the whole story. Other killers crowded the same street. Artillery still smashed more armor. Mines still tore apart tracks. Air bursts, blocked routes, mechanical failures, and confusion all did their share. The Panzerfaust became the image of late-war tank fear because it fit the camera. One man, a narrow street, a sudden hit, a tank burning in place. The records give it less than the legend does, but what they give is more precise. They give it a location. A tank crew could scan a road for a gun pit, a hedge line, a tree line. They could search for a barrel. The Panzerfaust changed that. The threat was not a gun position waiting in the open. It was a single-use launcher already inside the street, behind a cracked window, in the hands of someone who needed one close shot and one clear lane. Number 13. The Screaming Smoke Mortar. On the Eastern Front in 1941, a German infantry column would hear it before it saw it. A 6-tube launcher, towed on a light 2-wheeled carriage, rolled up close behind the assault line. The crew laid the tubes and loaded 6 150mm rockets. Then they moved clear before the electric firing circuit snapped them loose from cover. The weapon had a strange official name and an even stranger reputation. It was called a smoke launcher. The name was not a joke, but it was only part of the story. It came from the Nebeltruppen, the German smoke and chemical warfare troops. Officially, the system was the 15-centimeter Nebelwerfer 41. By the time American infantrymen met it in Normandy, nobody was thinking about fog. They were thinking about the sound. John J. Whitmire of the U.S. 79th Infantry Division remembered a screaming Mimi coming down on the hedgerows. One 10-man patrol from his unit was simply gone. Not hit one by one. Gone together, within the same few seconds. The name hid what the launcher actually did. 6 tubes sat on a split-trail carriage, and the whole thing weighed about 1,195 pounds, roughly 542 kilograms. Light enough to drag forward with the infantry, heavy enough to hold its place once set. It did not fire like a gun. It sounded like a warning siren breaking into violence. The rockets spun from 26 canted nozzles. Their warhead sat at the rear, not the nose, so the blast burst above ground instead of burying itself in dirt. The effect was not a clean strike. It was pressure, fragments, smoke, and a patch of earth that no longer belonged to the men standing on it. By then, the killing had already changed shape. Rifle kills at a point. A shell can be placed. 6 rockets arriving in a timed pattern turn a small area into a trap before the men inside it can decide where to move. U.S. intelligence manuals recorded a firing order of 1, 4, 6, 2, 3, 5, because a simultaneous blast could overturn the launcher. Even the German crew had to work around the violence of their own weapon. A full discharge took about 10 seconds, though wartime intelligence reports also described it as fast as 5, with 1-second intervals. Short enough to feel instantaneous, long enough for each impact to pile onto the last. Its official range was longer than a man's chance to react to it. The high-explosive rocket could reach 7,330 yards. The smoke round went a little farther, about 7,550. By then, the crew was already pulling back, because the launch signature gave away the position at once. Smoke, shriek, impact. By the time soldiers could identify the source, the rockets had already done the thing that made them feared. One impact had become many. Not a single wound, but a field of wounded men, broken cover, shattered nerves, and no clear sense of where the next burst would come from. In the hedgerows of Normandy, that sound was often enough. Allied soldiers remembered the incoming rockets as vividly as the blast itself, because the noise reached their bodies before the fragments did. The launcher came out of smoke and chemical troops. In practice, it became a massed, high-explosive terror weapon. It was called a fog thrower. What soldiers feared was the barrage inside it. Number 12. The rifle between worlds. What do you call a weapon that arrives too late to save the army using it, but still shapes the armies that defeat it? In 1938, at Poltewerk in Germany, the answers started with a cartridge, not a rifle. Not yet. Engineers were dealing with a simple battlefield problem. Most infantry combat was not happening at the long ranges imagined by full-power rifle doctrine, but a 9mm submachine gun lost usefulness too quickly. So they built something in between, the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, a shortened round pushing an 8.1-gram, 125-grain bullet at about 680 meters per second. It had less recoil than the standard rifle cartridge and far more reach than a pistol round. That compromise was the point. Power by itself was not enough. A soldier needed a gun he could fire fast, carry forward, and still control when the range opened past a street corner. By 1942, C.G. Hennel's team under Hugo Schmeisser had wrapped that idea in wood and stamped steel. The weapon appeared as the MKB-42H. It was 940 millimeters long with a 419 millimeter barrel. It fed from a 30-round magazine and weighed 5.22 kilograms empty. The name was clumsy. The effect was not. In infantry hands, It gave one-man selective fire at ranges where an MP-40 was fading and a Kar 98K was becoming slow. It could run at about 500 rounds per minute if he held the trigger down. But that was not what mattered. He did not need to hold it down. He could fire bursts he could actually keep on target. Germany's war in the East made that urgent. The weapon went to the Eastern Front, and the reports came back with exactly what designers wanted to hear. It worked. German troops found they could put controllable automatic fire beyond submachine gun distance. That was the gap this gun had been built to fill. But the rifle entered a system that did not fully believe in it. Hitler resisted the new cartridge and the new category behind it. It clashed with older ideas about what an infantry weapon was supposed to be. So the gun partly survived by changing its name. First, MP-43, then MP-44. Then, in late 1944, Sturmgewehr 44, Assault Rifle 44, a name big enough to sound like a battlefield revolution. It became famous before it became common. In 1944, German factories produced 281,860 weapons from the MP-43, MP-44, and STG-44 family. In 1945, they produced another 124,616 before the Reich collapsed. Even with the higher estimates, the total reaches only around 426,000 to perhaps 450,000. That is enough to build a legend. It is not enough to rearm an army bleeding on multiple fronts. The gap between reputation and reality shows up in one number from the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, one high-priority SS formation, the 2nd Battalion of the 26th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, had 11 MP-43s. 11. During one of Germany's last major offensives for an entire battalion. By then, American troops were meeting the weapon for the first time. The U.S. Army later placed that first encounter in the Ardennes, December 1944. From the Allied side, the timing is striking. You are fighting an enemy that is collapsing, and then some of the men in front of you are carrying a gun that feels like it belongs to the next war. Not a bolt-action rifle, not a pistol-caliber burp gun, in between, and better for the distances that infantry actually fought at. This gun lost its war. It still changed everyone else's. In early 1945, First Lieutenant James Clifford Brace of the U.S. 739th Tank Battalion ran into the clearest image of that contradiction. He captured a railroad car filled with freshly manufactured STG-44s, new rifles, boxed and moving by rail, while Germany was already running out of space, fuel, time, and trained men. That scene resolves the paradox from the beginning. The STG-44 became famous even though it failed to save Germany because its battlefield value and its strategic irrelevance were both true at once. At squad level, it solved a real problem. At national level, it arrived inside a defeat too large for one weapon class to change. So when people call the STG-44 one of the first successful assault rifles, they are naming a victory, but not a German one. Its real triumph came after the front had already broken, after the renamings, after the shortages, after the rail cars. Other armies studied the balance it struck between recoil, range, magazine capacity, and automatic fire. They kept the lesson, even though the Reich could not keep the ground. Early 1945. A U.S. lieutenant slides open a captured railroad car. Inside, the future is stacked in crates. Number 11. The gun that refused one job. The anti-aircraft gun that tanks learned to fear. On July 22, 1942, at El Alamein, Australian infantryman Philip Loughman rode toward Ruin Ridge on a Valentine tank. He expected the usual arithmetic of desert war: distance, dust, a ridgeline, incoming fire somewhere ahead. Tank crews could feel relatively safe at ranges where many guns were still guessing. The shells over his unit were not guessing. They burst overhead. Shrapnel dropped into shallow slit trenches and turned cover into a trap. By the second day, Loughman recalled, 14 men in his unit had been killed by Flak. Start with the distance. The Flak 36 could reach 14,660 meters at 45 degrees. That is more than 14 kilometers of gunfire from a weapon that did not need to crawl forward to become dangerous. Start with the ceiling. 10,600 meters, high enough to meet bombers, which was the job Germany had built it for. Start with the rate of fire. 15 to 20 rounds per minute, official figures, from a gun firing a 9-kilogram projectile. One shell is a hard metal fact. 15 of them in a minute is pressure. It keeps men down, crews rattled, and tanks second-guessing ground they thought they could cross. That matters for the larger question running through this war. Some weapons were deadliest because they killed in huge numbers. Others because they changed how soldiers moved, paused, and survived even before the casualties were counted. The 88 sits in that second category first. Men feared it before they measured it. The designation sounds tidy. Flak 18, then Flak 36, then Flak 37. But the numbers hide what made the weapon so difficult to pin down. In 1934, the Flak 18 had already appeared as standard German heavy anti-aircraft artillery. By 1942, around 15,000 88mm guns formed the bulk of German heavy flak defense. This was never some rare specialist piece wheeled out for a dramatic photograph. It existed in mass, in batteries, in training systems, in logistics, in doctrine. Because it existed in mass, it kept refusing the neat boundaries printed in manuals. Take the projectile again. 9 kilograms, fired fast enough to threaten aircraft overhead, but with velocity high enough to tear into heavily armored targets at distances where many tank guns struggled to answer. That is where the legend begins, but not the whole legend. In North Africa, German crews did not leave the weapon pointed at the sky out of loyalty to its original purpose. They lowered it. They used it against tanks, infantry, and gun positions at long range because the battlefield rewarded anything that could hit first and hit hard. Now look at the variants the way an ordnance officer would, dry and unsentimental. The real difference between the Flak 36 and the Flak 37 was not some dramatic reinvention of the barrel. The tube remained broadly familiar. The break came in production and fire control. The 36 was easier to mass produce. The 37 improved data transmission for directing fire. The weapon became more dangerous because Germany got better at building it, and better at telling it where to shoot. Even the surviving guns blur the categories. The Australian War Memorial's own example is a Flak 36 with a Flak 18 barrel, a hybrid. Clean museum diagram, but a reminder that real war machines are repaired, modified, mixed, and sent back out. The famous 88 was often less a single perfect object than a family of guns with a shared reputation. And reputation mattered almost as much as penetration tables. Allied soldiers began calling almost any German artillery fire an 88. That is not precise language, it is battlefield language. If a shell arrived fast, hard, and from farther out than expected, men named the thing they feared most. So the 88 became two weapons at once. One was steel, a heavy gun with reach, altitude, and velocity. The other was psychological, an explanation for sudden death in open ground. That is why the numbers never quite settle the question by themselves. Yes, the gun could hit aircraft over 10 kilometers up. Yes, it could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Yes, it could reach out beyond 14 kilometers. But casualty estimates tied to the 88 are hard to isolate because the weapon grew larger in memory than in paperwork. Soldiers often blamed the 88 even when other German guns were responsible. The myth spread because the performance was real, and the performance spread because the gun kept appearing where it was not supposed to be. So go back to Ruin Ridge. A tank rolls into a zone that should feel survivable at that range. Then overhead bursts drive infantry into slit trenches that are no protection at all. The crew thinks it has met a tank killer. Officially, it has not. Officially, the 8.8 centimeter Flak 18, 36, and 37 were heavy anti-aircraft guns. The tank-hunting terror at El Alamein began life as air defense. Number 10. The wake you could not see. On the night of November 30th, 1942, off Tassafaranga Point on Guadalcanal, American cruisers opened fire and watched a Japanese destroyer burn. Radar had found the target first. Shells landed fast. For a few minutes, the battle looked finished before it had properly begun. Then, around 23:29, heavy ships in the U.S. line began exploding as if something had reached them through empty water. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka had not sailed from Buin looking for a grand fleet action. He was trying to run supplies and a few troops to hungry Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright's force caught his column in the dark, and the picket destroyer Takanami was smashed so badly she was left burning. By every surface sign, the Americans had the fight in hand. Then torpedoes started arriving from farther out than they expected. Tanaka's destroyers had no radar, but they did have drill, speed, and one of the most dangerous naval weapons of the war. Under fire, they turned, accelerated, and launched a spread of Type 93 torpedoes. Each one was 24 inches across, 29 feet 6 inches long, and weighed about 5,952 pounds. Inside was a warhead of roughly 1,080 pounds of explosive. That was enough to break a cruiser open. What made crews fear it was not only the size of the hit, it was how far away the launch point could be. At one setting, the Type 93 could run about 20,000 meters at 48 knots. At another, 32,000 meters at 40 knots. At its longest reach, around 40,000 meters at 36 knots. In a night battle, those numbers changed the map in a commander's head. Could see muzzle flashes, judge where the danger should be, and still be wrong by miles. USS Minneapolis was hit first, then USS New Orleans. On New Orleans, the forward magazines exploded and the bow was blown off. Pensacola was struck and badly crippled. Later, Northampton took a hit and sank. A Japanese supply mission had failed in its immediate purpose, but a handful of destroyers had mauled a stronger American cruiser force. The damage mattered beyond the ships themselves. A weapon had exposed a false picture of the battlefield. The Type 93 did that with chemistry. Most torpedoes of the period used compressed air in their propulsion systems. The Japanese Type 93 used a kerosene-oxygen wet heater system. Oxygen-enriched propulsion meant more efficient combustion. The torpedo could run faster and farther than many contemporaries while leaving far less visible wake. Not invisible, just faint enough, especially at night, that the ocean gave fewer warnings than sailors expected. Men could stare into black water and see nothing that matched the damage about to hit them. That hidden approach later gave the weapon its famous English-language nickname, the Long Lance. But that was not the operational Japanese name. It was a post-war label popularized in English by Samuel Eliot Morison. Like many good nicknames, it can make the weapon sound cleaner and more mythic than combat really was. The record is rougher than the legend. There were misses. There were premature detonations. There were wake detonations. Japanese hit rates did not always match pre-war expectations. The myth came later. Steel and explosive came first. Even so, the legend did not come from nowhere. The National World War II Museum notes that 23 Allied warships hit by Type 93 torpedoes sank during the war. Early in the Pacific, Allied forces repeatedly underestimated Japanese night fighting skill and torpedo range. They expected danger at one distance and received it from another. NavWeps argues that in many actual engagements, the torpedo's speed at shorter combat ranges may have mattered more than those extreme long-distance settings. That makes the weapon more unsettling. It was not only a long-range threat. Once the geometry tightened, it was brutally fast. Go back to Tassafaranga. You were on an American cruiser. The enemy has been surprised. One Japanese destroyer is already burning. The range feels workable. The initiative feels yours. Then a hit tears into the ship from a direction that does not make sense in time. Another cruiser loses her bow. Another slows, burns. Another will not make it home. Nothing in the darkness seems close enough to explain the pattern. But the launches had already happened. A 24-inch oxygen torpedo had crossed the water too fast and with too little wake for men trained on older assumptions. Beyond the gun flashes, where the sea looked empty, Japanese destroyers had fired. Number 9. The tank built for a long war. On October 4, 1941, south of Mutsensk near Oryol, Colonel Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade hit the German 4th Panzer Division head-on. The scene carried a contradiction. Soviet tanks were being lost in huge numbers that year. Some were abandoned, some knocked out, some left broken by the roadside. Yet one of those tanks was already becoming the symbol of Soviet armored strength. Look first at the front plate. 45 millimeters. By itself, that number does not sound extraordinary. Angle it sharply, and the effect changes. A shell no longer meets a flat wall. It strikes, glances, sheds energy, or fails outright. Then the tracks. They were wide enough to spread 28,000 kilograms over mud and churned fields where narrower vehicles dug in. Then the gun. A 76.2 millimeter F-34 with 77 rounds carried inside. Then the engine. A 500 horsepower V234 diesel pushed the tank to 55 kilometers an hour on roads, around 40 off-road. Those figures look neat on paper. The autumn ground near Mutsensk tested them for real. German crews near Mutsensk had already learned how to kill tanks in Poland and France. There, the methods had worked. Here, some did not. Anti-tank guns hit the T-34's front and achieved less than expected. German tanks watched Soviet machines cross broken ground and autumn mud that should have slowed any armored attack to a crawl. The surprise was not a miracle weapon appearing from nowhere. It was a Red Army tank with the right shape for this war. Low hull, sloped armor, wide tracks, a gun that mattered. Mutsensk was only the visible part. Another number sat behind the armor, far from the gun sight. 18 to 21, November 1941. German specialists were already in Guderian's sector, studying captured T-34s. They bent over the tanks and measured what stood in front of them. The long gun, the sloped armor, the track width, the mobility. That inspection fed the emergency hunt for a new German medium tank, the road that led toward the Panther. Few weapons do that in the middle of a war. The T-34 did. It survived enemy fire and forced enemy redesign. That still does not explain why it became deadly on the scale it did. The key number is not 45 millimeters or 76.2 millimeters. It is 1,250. At the Stalingrad tractor factory in 1941, about 1,000 of 1,250 T-34s were built after the German invasion had already begun. That changes the whole picture. The factories were not building for some safe future. They were producing while retreating, evacuating, improvising, and bleeding. If the deadliest weapon in this war is simply the one soldiers feared most, the answer stays on the battlefield. If deadliness also means a weapon that keeps coming back after you thought you had destroyed it, the T-34 looks different. It was dangerous because it could be replaced. Put the numbers in colder terms. 4 men in the early T-34-76, a cramped turret, poor visibility, uneven workmanship, brutal losses. None of that is myth. The tank was not comfortable, not elegant, and not consistently well finished. Wartime simplification gave it a different kind of protection. At factory number 112, hull component work fell from about 200 hours to 36 hours by December 1941. The machine had not become delicate. The system behind it had learned how to turn armor plate into more hulls faster. This is how the contradiction starts to close. A tank can be technically strong and still fail if each loss cannot be replaced. The T-34 was often lost. Its losses did not end its presence. They were fed back into production. Damaged tanks were repaired. New ones arrived. Crews died. Machines burned. Columns vanished into snow or mud. And still more came forward. On the battlefield, the same silhouette kept returning. By 1944, the design itself shifted. The T-34/85 raised the weight to about 32 tons, added an 85mm gun, and expanded to a 5-man crew. That mattered. The Soviets were not stamping out one frozen design forever. They were improving the machine they could already build in huge numbers. Availability came first. Refinement followed under fire. So the T-34's deadliness did not come from one duel near Oryol, one clean penetration, or one famous photograph of a burnt German column. It came from the combination: enough armor, enough gun, enough mobility, and production large enough that tactical losses did not remove it from the war. German officers first met that fact in the fields south of Mtsensk. German engineers met it with measuring tools in November. German industry met it in the design panic that followed. The front armor could stop a shot. The wide tracks could cross the mud. The diesel could keep it moving. The sharpest number attached to the T-34 was this: Soviet factories kept turning out replacements while the war was still on top of them, and at one plant, the labor for hull components dropped from 200 hours to 36 by December 1941. Number 8. Stalin's organ. A monster is playing there, one German account said after the first Soviet rocket barrages of 1941. Not a cannon, not an aircraft, an organ. The nickname sounds almost playful until you picture what men at the front heard first. No melody, rising pipes, a shriek, a chord made of explosives. A truck had turned a roadside into an artillery battery. On June 28, 1941, 6 days after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Captain Ivan Flerov received the first experimental battery of BM-13 rocket launchers. 7 vehicles, crews pulled together in haste. A few training sessions near Moscow, and that was all. By July 2nd, they were already moving west toward a front collapsing faster than the paperwork around it. Even the bureaucracy blurred the weapon's identity. Rocket troops were officially labeled Guards Mortar Units, as if an old artillery name might hide what this machine was. By July 14th, German forces had taken Orsha, a rail junction in present-day Belarus. A rail junction meant concentration: trains, fuel, ammunition, troops, equipment. Everything an army needed, packed into one place because railways forced it there before it could spread out again. Flerov placed his 7 launchers near Godichi, about 5 to 6 kilometers from the station. The BM-13 did not have to sit on top of a target. Its M13 rockets, 132 millimeters across, could reach more than 8 kilometers. That was enough. At 15:15, the battery fired. One BM-13 could launch 16 rockets in about 7 to 10 seconds. 7 launchers meant 112 rockets almost at once. Each carried a 4.9 kilogram high-explosive fragmentation warhead. Those figures look modest next to giant siege guns or later strategic bombing. The effect came from something else. Not precision, compression. Tube artillery might spend minutes walking shells onto a target. The Katyusha threw its violence into a few seconds across a wide area crowded with trains, men, fuel, and ammunition. Picture the geometry of Orsha at that moment. You were standing near the station or the crossing over the Orshitsa River. Packed rolling stock is all around you. There is no long registration sequence, no patient ranging shots giving you time to run. First comes the rising mechanical howl. Then the air fills all at once. The station, the bridge, the rail cars, the fuel, the men beside them. Suddenly all of it is inside one burst of blast and fragments. Soviet reports later stressed the destruction. They also stressed the panic and a temporary halt in the German advance. A weapon does not need the biggest shell to be decisive. Sometimes speed does the work. Sometimes the shock comes from how little time exists between warning and impact. Then the weakness showed itself. ABM-13 needed 5 to 10 minutes to reload. Empty, it was just a truck with rails. But that same fact kept it alive. It was a truck. Fire. Move. Survive. Tube artillery often stayed fixed to the logic of its own guns. The Katyusha belonged to the road. By the time counter-battery fire searched for the launch point, the launchers could already be pulling away, leaving smoke, scorched ground, and men still trying to understand what had hit them. That mobility helped the system spread quickly. Wartime production began on June 21, 1941, right on the edge of catastrophe. In July 1941 and December 1944, the Soviet Union built 10,114 self-propelled multiple launchers. Later, the BM-13N standardized the design so the launcher assembly could be built separately and mounted on different chassis, especially the Studebaker 6x6. It sounds like a factory detail. In war, It meant fewer bottlenecks, simpler repairs, and more launchers reaching more fronts. The Scream could be built again and again. The nickname still matters. Stalin's organ makes the weapon sound theatrical, almost musical. It was not. The image came from the launch rails and from the sound itself, that layered organ-like wail as rockets left the truck in sequence. German troops remembered the noise because memory catches sound before it catches calibers or production totals. A gun can be feared for what it hits. A rocket battery can be feared for the seconds before impact, when the noise tells you the strike has already started. The BM-13 belongs in a different category from the tank we just left behind. The T-34 kept returning because Soviet industry could replace losses. The Katyusha showed something else that industry had learned under invasion. It could mount explosive force on wheels and deliver it in one overwhelming breath. Not careful, not surgical. Sudden. A road shoulder, a short halt, rails lifting toward the sky. Then a sound like a giant dragging its hands across the pipes of an organ. By the time you heard it, the full salvo was already on its way. Number 7. The Convoy Killer. On October 8, 1939, U-47 slipped out of Kiel under sealed orders. She was a Type 7 boat, 67 meters long, with 4 bow tubes, 1 stern tube, and 14 torpedoes packed into a pressure hull built to get close enough to ruin someone's night. Günther Prien was not hunting a warship in open water. He was steering towards Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's main anchorage in Orkney. Britain kept its fleet there behind block ships, darkness, and the belief that the harbor itself was enough of a shield. It wasn't. By the evening of October 13th, Prien had chosen electric G7E torpedoes instead of mines. They were slower, but they were quiet. No bubble trail, no bright white wake curling behind them. In a night harbor, that mattered more than speed. A merchant sailor nearby would have heard the first impact below the waterline as a dull shock through steel. Not a roar, a thud. The kind of hit that makes men look at one another before they even know what they're looking for. This attack was aimed at more than a ship. It went after the sense of safety that came with anchor chains and harbor lights. Prien surfaced after dark and slipped into Holmes Sound. Then he threaded U-47 through Kirk Sound between the block ships, scraping bottom and nearly fouling a cable as he forced a 67-meter submarine through a gap meant to stop him. He was inside the harbor, and the Royal Navy still did not know it. Just before 1 a.m. on October 14th, he found HMS Royal Oak at anchor. The first bow salvo produced only one visible explosion. Many aboard thought it was an internal accident. That confusion bought him minutes. He turned, reloaded, and fired again. 1:16 a.m., 3 torpedoes hit in quick succession. Royal Marine Horace Baber woke to the ship listing, flames in the mess deck, and water pouring in. About 834 men died, including 100 boy seamen under 18. The ship was supposed to be protected by geography, by depth, by routine. The sea had let something through. U-47 was still not empty. Prien's log shows that after the attack and the escape, he still had 5 torpedoes aboard for merchant targets. That changes the scale of what sailed into Scapa Flow. This was not a single strike against a capital ship. It was a compact delivery system moving through the Atlantic, still carrying enough violence to hunt food, fuel, troops, and war material on the way home. German Type 7 U-boats formed the backbone of the Battle of the Atlantic submarine campaign. That campaign attacked the chain that kept Britain alive. The G7A and G7E mattered for a reason. The G7A could run 6,000 meters at 44 knots, or 14,000 meters if you were willing to let it crawl. The G7E traded speed for stealth. It was trackless and quiet, but its batteries needed heat, care, and regular servicing every few days. One torpedo announced itself. The other slipped in unseen. In a harbor at midnight, the silent one was often deadlier. The Royal Navy answered with convoys, escorts, sonar, radar, code-breaking, and air patrols. Once U-boats began cutting merchant shipping, the target was not only the first ship they hit, it was the pantry behind it. the fuel behind that. The supply line stretched thin across the Atlantic. Then another contact was already moving in the dark. Number 6. The City Burner. In 1943, at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, Hoyt C. Hoddle stood in a desert full of houses that were never meant to shelter anyone. They were built to burn. Hoddle was an MIT fire scientist, not a bomber pilot. That was the point. The Army, Standard Oil Development, and the Chemical Warfare Service wanted proof that an incendiary bomb worked in something more convincing than a target board. So they built a village. Not a generic one, a Japanese one. Architect Antonin Raymond drew on his years in Tokyo. The builders copied details that sound almost domestic enough to make the setting feel ordinary for a second. Sliding screens, tatami mats, light interior partitions, the materials of everyday life. That choice mattered because the bomb under test did not rely on blast. It relied on sequence. A cluster opened in the air. Small bomblets spilled out. A cloth tail stabilized each one as it fell. On impact, a fuse waited 3 to 5 seconds, long enough for the casing to punch in and settle where a fire could feed. Then the charge inside ignited and threw burning gel sideways, not as a cinematic fireball, but as a controlled, ugly spray inside a room, under eaves, across paper and wood. The casing itself looked unimpressive, about 19.5 inches long, just 2.88 inches across, roughly 6.2 pounds in total, with only about 2.6 pounds of jellied gasoline inside. Small enough to look harmless in the hand, small enough to hide what it was built to do. Hoddle later recalled B-25s dropping competing incendiaries from about 5,000 feet over those test structures. Old thermate bombs went in. Magnesium bombs went in. The one that kept proving itself was this stubby steel tube with a cloth tail. At 10,000 feet, he said, the tests did not give useful results. At 5,000, they did. At that height, a city was no longer just the place below. It became part of the weapon. By the middle of the war, the scale of that design was clear. The AN-M69 was usually not dropped alone. A common 500-pound M19 cluster carried 38 of them. One aircraft was not delivering one incendiary. It was delivering containers that opened into dozens and dozens into hundreds, spread across neighborhoods built closely enough for one roof to answer the next. Each bomblet could burn for 4 to 7 minutes at roughly 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Burning material could be thrown as far as 75 yards. In a field, that is just a measurement. In a district of wood, paper, and packed homes, it is a map of spread. This is where the idea of the deadliest weapon starts to shift. Not toward what soldiers feared in a trench or on a road, but toward what happened when war stopped aiming only at a factory gate and started using the district around it. American documents describe Japanese urban industry as dispersed, woven through residential blocks, workshops, and family homes. So a target could be labeled industrial, while the bomb's success still depended on walls, floors, screens, bedding, rafters, alleys, and wind. On the night of March 9th into March 10th, 1945, General Curtis LeMay's 21 Bomber Command put that logic over Tokyo. The raid dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries, more than 16 square miles burned. Officially, the dead were listed at 83,793. Other estimates run to 100,000. The arithmetic changes fast. An omelet weighing 6.2 pounds does not sound like a city killer. 38 in a cluster still sound manageable. But hundreds of bombers laying incendiaries into one dense urban area do not create separate fires for long. They create joining fires. Streets become chimneys. Rooms pull flame inward. People who were never near a military installation are trapped by radiant heat, smoke, collapsing structures, and the speed at which escape routes vanish. That speed was built into the weapon. The M69's delay let it lodge before igniting. Its gel did not simply burn where it landed. It spread flame laterally, inside the structure, where buckets, sand, and reflex no longer mattered much. The house did not just catch fire. It started passing fire along. That is what the Dugway village was built to measure. Not whether fire was hot, whether ordinary architecture could be turned into an accomplice, whether floors would hold the casing for a moment, whether screens would stop it or feed it, whether domestic space itself could be made to participate. By the time reports and mission summaries called the Tokyo raid an attack on strategic and industrial targets, the working mechanism had already been rehearsed in Hotel's desert village 2 years earlier. A steel tube, a cloth tail, a few pounds of gelled gasoline, a short delay. Below it, wood, paper, and densely packed homes, already waiting. Number 5. The Buzz Bomb. Before dawn on June 13, 1944, people in southern England woke to a sound they did not yet have a name for. It was low, mechanical, and stubbornly alive. The engine buzzed overhead while the sky was still dark, and everyone below learned the same terrible rule. If the buzz stopped, the bomb was no longer coming in level. It was falling. A city learned to count by engine noise. At 4:18 a.m., the first V1s were already coming down near Swanscombe, Kent. Minutes later, around 4:25, one reached Grove Road in Mile End, London. It smashed into a railway bridge and nearby houses. To the people on the ground, it did not look like a traditional bomb. It looked like a stub-winged aircraft with fire behind it, flying too low and too fast to belong to any familiar kind of war. English Heritage counts 6 dead and 42 injured there. The Imperial War Museum gives 6 dead, 30 injured, and 200 homeless. Even the numbers do not quite line up. The weapon hit before the record could settle around it. This was the V1 in its first public form over Britain, the world's first operational cruise missile, a pulse jet-powered flying bomb, launched without a pilot, without a crew, and without mercy. Its warhead carried roughly 2,100 pounds of high explosive. Its cruise speed sat around 375 to 400 miles an hour. Its range could reach about 150 miles from the French coast. That was enough to make London a target from far beyond the front line. By the end of the campaign, more than 20,000 had been launched against British and continental targets. Not all reached their marks. Enough did that the sound itself became part of the attack. The V1 was never meant to slip in unheard, announced itself. Civilians learned the pattern quickly. The buzz overhead meant it was still flying. The sudden silence meant the fuel cut off and the bomb had begun its final dive. People froze in doorways, under stairs, beside walls. They counted the seconds between sound and impact. The weapon gave them a warning, but only in the cruelest form. It made waiting a skill. It made the sky a timer. By late June 1944, the barrage had scaled up fast. The RAF Museum notes that by June 29th, about 2,000 V1s had already been launched from 40 operational sites. That was the opening surge. Over the next months, scattered attacks turned into sustained pressure, first on London and then on Antwerp. There, the bomb shifted from a weapon against civilian streets to a weapon against Allied logistics. Britain answered with fighters, anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, bombing raids on launch sites, and then with the simplest solution of all, ground advance. As Allied troops overran the launch areas in northern France, the map changed. So did the target. The fear the V1 created was not only about distance, it was about rhythm. A bomber could be heard, a shell could be tracked. A V1 came with a buzz that told you it was still up there, still moving, still on its way. Then the sound vanished. That silence was the first sign that the weapon had entered its last seconds. By the end of the campaign, the London area had absorbed about 2,419 of them. The Smithsonian records 6,184 killed and 17,981 seriously injured there. Behind those numbers was a machine built to occupy the mind before the blast. First the buzz, then the cut, then impact. Number 4. The unheard rocket. What did witnesses mean when they said the explosion came first? On December 16, 1944, Antwerp was supposed to be behind the line, not on it. The Scheldt had been cleared. The port had reopened to Allied shipping on November 28th. The city had become a lifeline for the armies pushing east. Soldiers on leave drifted into cafes, theaters, and cinemas. In rear areas, war could briefly pretend to loosen its grip. That afternoon, 24-year-old British soldier Jim Mills tried to get into an Ensa show. It was sold out. He turned away and walked to Cinema Rex on De Kaiserlei, where The Plainsman was playing. Hundreds were already inside. Civilians, servicemen, people grabbing 2 hours back from a war measured in timetables and tonnage. At 15:23, the roof came down. The first accounts sound impossible. No rising whine, no engine overhead, no descending rush. The V1 had taught people a terrible way to listen. As long as the pulse jet buzzed, the bomb was still somewhere above you. This was different. Survivors described a sharp crack and then a heavy explosion with no warning the mind could use. The weapon was not silent. It was faster than the warning. The missile had been fired from the Netherlands. It was about 46 feet tall. It weighed nearly 13 metric tons at launch. It carried roughly a 1-ton high-explosive warhead. In flight, it arced up to 50 to 60 miles high, the edge of space by wartime standards, then came down at around 3,400 miles per hour. London or Antwerp could be reached in roughly 5 minutes from launch. There was no pilot to shoot down, no engine note to track, no final seconds to crouch through. Rocket arrived before its own sound. Distance itself became surprise. Cinema Rex collapsed into the street. Mills survived. In a hospital basement, both of his legs were amputated. Many others never came out. The strike killed 567 people in one blow, 296 soldiers and 271 civilians. For Antwerp, it was the deadliest single V-weapon attack of the war. The number matters because it shows what this machine was actually for. Not battlefield precision, not a tank line broken open. A city hit without reply. A port shaken. A logistics hub turned suddenly into a grave. Germany opened the first operational V2 campaign on September 8, 1944. Paris in the morning, London that evening. Over the next months, thousands followed. Totals shift depending on whether you count only confirmed operational launches, failed shots, Britain alone, or all Allied targets. The overall shape is clear. Germany built about 6,000 V2s in 1944 and 1945. It launched more than 2,600 of them, and some counts pushed the total fired to over 3,000. Most were aimed at London and Antwerp. Somewhere around 5,000 to 5,500 people were killed by the impacts. That is the myth the V2 leaves behind. It is remembered as a wonder weapon, the first ballistic missile, the machine that pointed toward the space age. All of that is true. The evidence is less romantic. Its range was about 200 miles. Its warhead was heavy but not city-destroying on the scale of later strategic bombing. Its guidance was crude. For all its technical brilliance, it did not change the outcome of the war. It changed the psychology of attack. Larger question running under this story: what made a weapon deadly in World War II? The V2 gives a different answer. Not the weapon that killed the most, the weapon that made defense, briefly, meaningless. The evidence does not end at the impact site. The V2 was built in the Nebelwerfer tunnels by forced labor drawn through the Mittelbau camp system. At least 10,000 concentration camp workers died in V2 production alone. Broader deaths tied to Mittelbau are estimated around 20,000 to 25,000. The rocket killed at both ends of its arc. It killed in Antwerp and London. It killed even more surely in the mountain where it was assembled. The silence was never silence. The blast seemed to come first because the rocket was descending faster than sound, so the shock of impact reached people before any noise of arrival could warn them. The hardest fact sits elsewhere. The V2 killed a little over 5,000 people at its targets. Its production system consumed at least 10,000 forced laborers before many of the rockets ever left the ground. Number 3. Hitler's buzzsaw. the machine gun that made the ground feel lower. On June 6, 1944, American soldiers running into the German defenses at Omaha Beach heard a sound unlike ordinary gunfire. It came in a ripping sheet, high and hard, as if the shoreline itself had started tearing. That was the MG-42. Allied infantry would come to fear it as Hitler's buzzsaw. Not because of the nickname, because of what the sound meant. The gun entered German service in 1942, and by autumn of 1944, the Germans were fielding it at roughly 1 per 10-man squad. That number matters. This was not a rare specialist weapon sitting behind the line. It was built into the line. The MG-42 fired at about 1,200 to 1,500 rounds a minute. In practice, that meant a burst could arrive so fast that individual shots blurred into a single metallic tear. A museum example weighs 11.85 kilograms. That sounds manageable, until you imagine carrying it, feeding it, and keeping it alive under fire while it devours belts of ammunition like they are disappearing into a furnace. The danger was the pace. It forced every man around it to work at its rhythm. That is why the sound became part of its reputation. The nickname stuck because the gun sounded violent even before it hit anything. But sound alone does not make a battlefield weapon terrifying. What made soldiers freeze was the way the sound seemed to occupy space. A machine gun that fires that fast does not merely shoot across open ground. It fills the ground in front of it with the feeling that movement has become a mistake. Germany introduced the MG-42 as a replacement for the MG-34, and the design was stripped down for production. One gun could be made in about 75 hours, roughly half the time of the MG-34. That was efficiency turned into battlefield volume. The stamped sheet steel construction let factories train workers on individual parts instead of on the whole gun, which meant the machine could be built fast enough to matter at scale. Germany produced roughly 400,000 of them during the war. The weapon was deadly, but the system behind it made it dangerous everywhere at once. The doctrine around it matched that reality. German infantry squads were often organized around the machine gun, with riflemen supporting it, not the other way around. So the squad did not ask whether it could fire, it asked whether it could keep firing. That is a different kind of army. A rifle team looks for targets. A machine gun team builds a zone. The MG-42 turned the squad into a portable denial machine, and every choice around it, movement, cover, advance, retreat, had to bend around ammunition and barrel changes. A hot barrel could need changing after 200 to 250 rounds, and the swap could take under 20 seconds if the crew knew what it was doing. Under fire, 20 seconds is an eternity. So the gun was never just shot and forgotten. It had to be fed, cooled, shifted, and protected by men who were themselves part of the mechanism. The weapon did not merely multiply firepower, it reorganized labor in the middle of combat. At Omaha, that mattered because the Americans were trying to move onto the beach while the MG-42 was trying to make movement impossible. Every burst forced men lower. Every pause made them think the next burst was already coming. The gun's rate of fire did more than kill. It suppressed people into the earth, into shell holes, into the small, miserable space where you stay alive by staying still. That is why the sound is remembered so clearly. It was not just noise. It was a command. One post-war MG-42 in the National World War II Museum collection was recovered in Belgium by Private First Class Leonard Liniewski, then taken apart with the help of a German prisoner so he could mail it home in pieces. That image is almost absurdly ordinary compared with what the weapon meant in battle. But that is the point. The machine that once froze men in place could later be broken down on the back of a truck, piece by piece, as if it had simply been another object to carry. And yet the sound remained. Because what people remembered was not the metal. It was the moment the ground itself seemed to get lower. Number 2. The industrial poison. On the evening of September 3, 1941, inside Block 11 at Auschwitz I, the camp's deputy commandant, Karl Fritsch, turned a disinfectant into a method of murder. About 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish prisoners were herded into cellar cells. Zyklon B pellets were poured through openings above them. The windows were sealed shut. By the next morning, some were still alive, so more gas was added. A product sold for pest control was now being used for something far darker, inside the camp system and in full view of it. The deadliest poison does not always arrive on a battlefield. Zyklon B was a cyanide-based pesticide. That fact makes the scene more disturbing, not less. It belonged to the language of delousing rooms, laundry blocks, quarantine, and hygiene. In a camp built on paperwork and bureaucracy, that mattered. The same infrastructure used to fight lice and typhus also taught men to describe killing in clean, administrative terms. The first mass gassing at Auschwitz was not an accidental slide into horror. It was a test carried out inside a state-run machine that already knew how to isolate bodies, move them, and process them. The witnesses were prisoners ordered to deal with what came after. Kazimierz Haugas remembered the selection at the hospital. Stanislav Suliborski heard prisoners and dogs near the gate around 1100 at night. Jan Volny, an orderly, was forced to remove bodies from the cellar afterward. These names matter because they keep the event tied to human memory, not abstract totals. This was not chemistry in a laboratory. It was chemistry in a locked building, with guards, dogs, sealed doors, and people listening from the wrong side of the wall. The experiment did not remain small for long. In March 1942, Auschwitz-Birkenau began functioning as a killing center, and the crematorium morgue at Auschwitz I was adapted into a gas chamber. By 1943, purpose-built gas chamber crematoria were operating at Birkenau. The numbers became part of the buildings themselves, 8 gas chambers in total, 2 at Auschwitz I, including the test site, and 6 at Birkenau. One system, expanded until death had its own rooms. At Auschwitz, about 1.1 million people were murdered, including approximately 1 million Jews. Most Jewish victims were killed in gas chambers using Zyklon B. The method is brutally clear. No weapon fired at an enemy formation. No shell falling into a trench. A chemical tool used on civilians and prisoners who had already been stripped of every normal protection. By June 28, 1943, the Auschwitz construction office was calculating how many corpses the crematoria could handle per day. 4,416 in official figures, with prisoner Sonderkommando accounts giving a higher figure of about 8,000. These were not battlefield casualty reports, they were throughput numbers. The language is so cold it almost sounds unreal. Yet it was real enough to shape the buildings around it. The camp was organizing killing as a process. Majdanek shows how far that logic spread. In autumn 1942, gas chambers there used Zyklon B and carbon monoxide. The categories blur under pressure from the historical record. The camp could be described in one sense as concentration, and in another as extermination. People sealed inside, the distinction changed nothing. The exact number murdered specifically by Zyklon B cannot be fixed with precision. Records were destroyed. Bodies were never registered. As the war turned against them, the SS tried to erase the paper trail. But the weapon had already revealed the scale of the system that used it. Zyklon B was not deadly because it fought on a front line. It was deadly because a bureaucracy built to kill absorbed it, and a pesticide became part of genocide. Number 1. The final scale. The bombs that made every future war look over the edge. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project team watched the desert at Trinity flare brighter than night had any right to allow. In New Mexico, a steel tower held a device they called Gadget. It was a plutonium implosion bomb. When it fired, it released about 21 kilotons of force. Sand vitrified. The shock wave rolled outward. A laboratory idea had become a working weapon. One design had already crossed the line. Yet the war's ending is remembered through 2 bombs, not one. Hiroshima and Nagasaki arrived together in memory. Even though they were different machines, used on different mornings, under different conditions, and folded into a surrender crisis that was shifting by the hour. On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets flew a B-29 called Enola Gay toward Hiroshima with a bomb named Little Boy in its bay. It weighed about 9,000 pounds. It was not the Trinity device scaled up or refined. It used a different engineering logic entirely. A gun-type uranium design, simpler in concept, never tested in a full nuclear explosion before combat. At 8:15 a.m., Little Boy detonated about 1,800 feet above the city. One aircraft carried it in. One bomb fell. It burst over a living city. The blast became pressure, heat, collapse, fire, and glass driven like shot. Skin burned at a distance. Bodies were crushed under buildings. Streets turned into corridors of flame. Hiroshima City estimates about 140,000 deaths by the end of December 1945. Some died that morning. Others died hours later, or days later, or months later from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness that kept unfolding after the fireball was gone. Across both bombings, at least 100,000 people died directly, and at least another 100,000 later from radiation-related illness. The exact toll can never be fixed. Too many people disappeared into rubble, ash, hospital wards, and long illness. The scale of death mattered. The method mattered too. Before that morning, a city could be devastated by fleets, by waves, by repeated attack. At 8:15, destruction arrived in a single sortie. That was Hiroshima. It was not the end of the story. The next bomb was not as simple as memory makes it sound. On August 9th, Major Charles Sweeney took another B-29 boxcar toward Japan carrying Fat Man. This bomb was not Little Boy's twin. It was 3.25 meters long, 1.52 meters in diameter, and weighed about 4.5 tons. It was the combat version of the Trinity idea, a plutonium implosion bomb, denser, more complex, and already proven in the desert before it was used over a city. Its target was supposed to be Kokura. Smoke covered Kokura that morning. Smoke from previous bombing and fire on the ground turned aiming into guesswork. The crew diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man exploded about 503 meters above the city with a yield of about 21 kilotons. One of the defining moments in modern history reached its city because the first city on the list was hidden. Nagasaki's terrain changed the pattern of destruction, but not the human result. There was the flash, then the blast, then fire. Then the slower injuries that made survival temporary. The bomb kept killing after the burst, in hospitals, in shelters, in bodies with no visible wound that had already absorbed something lethal. What forced surrender is still argued over. Did these two attacks do it by themselves? Or was Japan also collapsing under another shock that landed between them when the Soviet Union declared war on August 8th? The timeline leaves almost no space between events. Hiroshima on the 6th, Soviet entry on the 8th, Nagasaki on the 9th, surrender announced days later. Cause and consequence press so tightly together that scholars are still trying to separate them 80 years on. That argument does not change what those 3 days revealed. 2 raids showed that destructive force once spread across fleets, bomb groups, and days of fire could be packed into a single device carried by a single aircraft. After 1945, every military planner had to look at war through that fact, not just how to win it, how to survive its opening minutes. So when people ask which weapon of World War II was the deadliest, the answer depends on scale. On battlefields, death came continuously. From the sky, terror could arrive unseen. In the camps, chemistry was turned into process. Then August 1945 set a new threshold. 1 bomber, 1 bomb, 1 city. Hiroshima was the first use. Nagasaki was the second. Japan's surrender followed, but not in a neat single-cause line. What began there did not end with surrender. It became deterrence, stockpiles, targeting doctrine, launch procedures, and the permanent fact that war had acquired a ceiling so high it looked like the end of history. Years after, the photographs remained. A watch stopped at 11:02, shadows fixed on stone. A city center erased by a burst that lasted seconds. The war ended. The nuclear age did not.